She also does not need introduction. She has been a diplomat. She has just returned from New York, after serving there for 2 terms as Pakistan's permanent representative. But I know Maleeha much more, actually. For me, it's much more important that we had shared bylines on many landmark stories, and that's why, actually, so that's her introduction. And then we have Genc. He is from Turkey. He's also a very well-known author and journalist. He's not the first time in Pakistan. I suppose you have been here before, in 2018 for the LLF. So shall I start with you, Vali? Vali, the fall of course, at the end of Cold War, we have witnessed the rise of what we call multilateralism as a core to the New World Order. Now, we are seeing actually this massive changes in international relations. We see the rise of Trump's era, and his America First slogan is also actually has rattled the world. In fact, actually, America was the guarantor of multilateral agencies which were formed after the Second World War. But now actually it seems that he is bent upon destroying all of them. So how do you see this new world taking shape?
Thank you very much, Zahid, and I want to thank LLF for inviting me back to Lahore. It's wonderful being here and seeing that this great institution continues to have the impact that we see on life and culture in Pakistan and in Lahore. And it's also great to be on this panel with colleagues. There's a number of things perhaps have been happening that are converging at this point in time. We have been seeing a gradual decline of American unipolar power, which we saw rise right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There has been the economic rise of China. Russia has been asserting itself in Europe, in Central Asia, and in Asia. And generally the notion that you had a sort of a Western institutions and world order would dominate was gradually receding. Examples of this, for instance, were reflected in China's refusal, for instance, to sign up to a lot of international agreements and institutions. Or where, for instance, when it decided to launch its own development bank, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, rather than join in the World Bank. Now, the Trump phenomenon has sort of accelerated this because it's the first time that the United States is saying that it doesn't believe in multilateral institutions that it created. And I have to say that there is no consensus on this in America. There's this very much a view that Trump is pushing from above, but even his own establishment is not supportive of this. It thinks it's going to be chaotic, that there's a great deal of value to these institutions and they ought to be preserved. But for Trump, the sort of the mantra is protection and promotion of sovereignty. So is in the recognition that every country should follow its own interests first, including America, and that multilateralism is not a useful principle. He has also discovered that he could use enormous amount of American power, particularly in the financial sector, to basically get the way that the United States wants. For instance, force the Europeans to abandon the Iran deal or sanctions countries for varieties of things. And in that kind of an environment, his argument is essentially that why do we really need European or others as cooperation where we can force them to follow our lead? And finally, I think he has put his shoulder to destructing multilateral institutions. So European Union is one, and NATO may be next on the block. He may very well withdraw from NATO once he's reelected. He has been disinterested for now in the United Nations. I think that's perhaps the best scenario for the United Nations. It's much worse than him being actively interested in dismantling the UN. But also other institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, institutions with which Pakistan has a lot of dealings or have also been undergoing a lot of pressure. So if he particularly gets reelected, the world is going to look very different. We're not going to have the post-World War II architecture we're familiar with in place.
So Maleeha, actually we have, over the years, we have seen profound changes in the international relations, and also the world has changed a lot, actually. It's not just about decline of American power or unipolar world, but also we have seen the emergence of other powers. So in that situation, what do you see? How do you see the, the new era or the new architecture will frame?
Thank you, Zahid. I'm also very privileged to be here. Thank you to LLF for inviting me, and wonderful to see Vali and Kaya, to meet Kaya. Zahid, I'd also like to address attention to a number of features of the global environment as it exists today, because these elements are intersecting or converging, as Vali put it, to produce something that we are seeing for the first time in many decades, which is a weakening commitment to multilateralism. So let's just ask ourselves, simply put, what is multilateralism? Multilateralism is the acknowledgement that there have to be global solutions to global challenges and global problems. In other words, you need international cooperation to address many of the issues that we confront today. So put simply, that is what multilateralism is. So the weakening commitment to multilateralism, I think we have to step back and sort of see what's happening in the world. First, of course, we see a diffusion of power, something that you've alluded to, and Vali has also mentioned. So global power is being redistributed in a world that is very multipolar, but we're also passing through history's, one of history's most unpredictable phases, where we see instability across the world. Secondly, we also see an effort by big countries, including the United States, but not only the United States, and regional powers, trying to rewrite the rules of the game and flouting international agreements and conventions. We see it in our own neighborhood, and of course we see it elsewhere in the world, including in the United States. Thirdly, we also see an anti-globalization sentiment sweeping parts of the world. In the West, the anti-globalization sentiment is based on different factors, and in the East, it's based on different factors. Globalization has not delivered evenly for everyone, so therefore you see this sentiment across the world. That also is leading to tariffs being imposed, protectionist policies being implemented by Western countries when they fail to compete with, for example, China. They do that, but the result of that is that it weakens multilateralism, and of course it weakens agreed rules of the game. We also see in the international environment an erosion of the rules-based international order as we knew it. Now, whether that order was established by the victors of the Second World War or others signed up to it, but whatever went by the name of the international order is being eroded, and agreed rules and norms are being violated with impunity by the United States, by Russia, by India, and you can go on and on, the list is long. So this is the world that we're living in. So what we are witnessing is a very unstable period where we simply don't know what we're transitioning to, but because it is extremely, it's multipolar, no single country today has the ability to achieve outcomes on its own. So we're also seeing another phenomenon, which is countries are now preferring not to get into formal alliances, but to form partnerships or networks with like-minded countries on specific issues. And that also is a new trend. But I would also sort of emphasize two things. One, the rise of strongmen in global politics, and the way that right-wing populist movements are sort of, their slogan is, we'll put our country first and it doesn't really matter what the world thinks about us. That too, naturally, is undermining multilateral cooperation and international cooperation. But along with that, so there's the top-down, which is leaders at the top violating or getting out of treaties, and we have so many examples. I mean, the US walked out of the Paris Agreement, they left the Human Rights Council, they left the Iranian agreement, even though the Security Council, they're a member of the Security Council, and the Security Council has not said that the Iran nuclear deal doesn't exist anymore. So, you know, there are many examples, Russia in Crimea, many, many examples of how multilateralism or agreed treaties and agreements are being rejected. But along with this is another trend, which is the bottom-up, if I can put it that way. And this is widespread public disillusionment with multilateral institutions across the world. It's in our country because of the unresolved issue of Jammu and Kashmir, as you all know, but it's also in other parts of the world, where especially young people ask whether global institutions are fit for purpose for the 21st century. And again, it doesn't matter what the history was. The point is, we're in the 21st century, and these multilateral institutions have to adapt to the new dynamics of the 21st century. And we have not seen that happen, because if you look at the UN, which is where I served for many, many years, and I will conclude, give Kaya a chance to come in, I can tell you, much of the public disillusionment, as I said, across the world, popular disillusionment, is directed at the UN as the premier global institution, the most important and the most universal institution that we have in the world. And much of that disillusionment or disappointment or even anger is directed at the Security Council, because the Security Council, as it is configured today, is reflective of a bygone era. The 5 permanent members rule through the veto, what should come on the agenda and what should not come on the agenda, what should get resolved, what should not get resolved. So the question that is raised, and I don't want to answer that, I think we can have the audience also pitch in later, the question we have to ask is, given this structure at the United Nations, how can we expect public faith to be renewed in the UN as well as in multilateralism? So these strong leaders play off this public sentiment as well. They know that this is there, but they do it for their own reasons, of course. So I think what we really need are multilateral institutions which adapt to 21st century dynamics and the diffusion and the redistribution of power. And also, they should not be predicated on only governments, because today public opinion counts for much more, and therefore the involvement of civil society, the involvement of the public in matters that affect them. Climate change doesn't just affect governments, it affects people, for example. And so do unresolved disputes. They affect real people. So I think multilateral institutions need to adapt, they need to be more inclusive, they need to be more egalitarian to reflect the world that we live in. And I think also we need to see much more of an effort by countries that believe in multilateralism. Because remember, it's only the big countries and the big regional powers that are rejecting multilateralism. The rest of the world, a country like ours, Pakistan, we've been one of the most ardent supporters of multilateralism, and we continue to be so, because we think that brings us benefits. So do, I think, out of 193 countries represented at the UN, I would think at least 180, if not more, would be very strong supporters of multilateralism. So what we're looking at is the effort by big countries and regional powers to change the rules of the game, but without really having the ability to put in place what they really want, because they don't have that power anymore. Thank you.
Kaya, coming to you. Well, actually, we just, Maleeha mentioned about emergence of a strong man. It's also actually last few years we have seen many places like Trump is not the only one. We have seen the same phenomena happening in other countries like Hungary, Turkey, India, and several other countries. And it's quite interesting, the rise of President Erdogan. Over the last 10, 15 years, we have seen actually he's emerging as the most powerful leader, not only Turkey, but also having influence over the region. His vision about, at one point he also had this vision of pan-Islamism. Does he still believe in that, or what does his really vision all about?
Well, he began as a multilateralist, interestingly, because Islam and conservative culture was very much repressed in Turkey through the 20th century after Atatürk's Republican Revolution. And so Erdogan and his people in the 1960s, they believed in something called the national vision, Milli Görüş, which said, we should not align with the European community, OECD, World Bank, but we should align with the non-aligned movement, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and we should look for our friends there. So this is a politician who grew up in the 1960s, believing in these ideals. And then in the 1990s, when he became a prominent figure in national politics in Turkey. He said, again, multilateralism is good. Let's become a member of European Union because there is a leviathan in Turkey, the secularist state that is, not allowing us to be ourselves. So let's fight it with the power of the European community behind us. So let's align with them and work together. And I think that alignment worked until the Davos, when Erdogan walked off the podium from Davos, when he was talking with Shimon Peres, and there was this discussion about Palestine and Israel, and David Ignatius moderating the event, and this huge show of anger from Erdogan, criticizing Israel and just walking off the stage. And after that, the message he delivered to people began to change. And he said, the world is not supporting Turkey, so we have to act on our own. And as his fears about coups and opposition grew, he came to the conclusion that Turkey's fate is embedded in his own character and his own survival. And if only he survives, that Turkey can survive. So a belief in multilateralism, be it Islamic or European, changed into something different. But I think the interesting point here is Erdogan's party, like Johnson's movement in England, we cannot just call it the Conservative Party, it's a different movement, and Trump's movement, not Republican but something else. This anti-establishment power, this thing existed in Turkey, and Erdogan could energize that base with the idea of multilateralism. That's an interesting thing. All the Islamists were, singing love songs for European Commission and these institutions, for Brussels and Washington. And the nativists in the country were criticizing them for being too multilateralist and for being too internationalist. But then came a point where I think there was a political calculation, where anti-establishment sentiment, I think Erdogan thought that demanded from him to become this kind of strong leader who doesn't listen to these institutions anymore. So that's a sad story we had in Turkey over the past 25 years, but we experienced them under the reign of one leader. So that's what makes Turkey special.
Wali, coming back to you, you said that American establishment and not all Americans agree with whatever Trump is doing. And now there's, one cannot be sure, but there seems that we could see a Trump too, if the things go like this. But in a way, actually, so far he has been successful in carrying out his policies. There has been a lot of opposition within the United States as well. When he pulled out from Paris Climate Accord, or unilaterally withdrew from Iranian nuclear deal, there has been some backlash, but there is still not so strong resistance to whatever he is trying to do.
Well, first of all, the American presidency over the years has gained more and more power at the cost of Congress and the bureaucracy. So the president has a lot of latitude to exercise power. And what Trump has found out is that, coming out of the Iran nuclear deal and the climate accords was easy, largely because these were not treaties in a sense of having been approved by Congress and requiring congressional action. In fact, in the case of Iran nuclear deal, and this fault actually falls with President Obama, that because he didn't want to take it to Congress, he didn't even call it an agreement. It was called a plan. Okay. So if you call something a plan, the next president can say, well, this was my predecessor's plan, and I'm no longer adhering to it. There were no legal sort of normative binds on Trump to not withdraw from this agreement. But I think what President Trump has found out is actually that he and many others, as Kay was saying, Erdogan, they actually no longer believe in the values that created the multilateral institutions. So the values of not just democracy at home, democracy abroad, giving equal rights to all countries to have equal voice like at the General Assembly of the United Nations. If you actually don't believe in this, and you don't believe that it has value, then multilateralism doesn't have value for you. I mean, in a sort of, if Trump actually had read political theory or was a political theorist, I would say he's an exaggerated Hobbesian. He believes the world is a jungle, and the biggest animal will rule, and the rest of being nice to others or bringing him along is unnecessary. And in a lot of actually Trump's power, particularly exercising it against Europeans, relies on American control of global finance, his ability to actually put economic pressure on other countries. And for now, he has discovered that actually the boundaries of resistance to American exercise of power are weaker than anybody had ever assumed, that America can get its way without cooperation of other countries, and that actually it can get a lot more than it had wanted, whether it's against China, Iran, or Europe. So we're in a phase where there might be certain degree of giddiness because the world was not prepared for Trump, and he's using multilateral institutions to his advantage when he can. He's dismissing them when he doesn't need them. And there is no sort of a reaction, and the reaction largely is because there was no preparation for it. I would assume at some point that there is going to be a reaction, not just from large countries, but also from smaller countries. But a lot also depends on whether he gets elected again, which right now we might say it's likely, because that would mean 5 more years of this battle against multilateral institutions, and that will have a very different effect.
Well, I think one more question. When you say actually he's trying to mold the multilateral agencies, like actually to have American, to further strengthen American domination or basically exceptionalism, do you think he's just trying to modify them, or it's complete rejection?
No, he sees them as a tool of power. In other words, it's no commitment to the value of these institutions in of themselves, or there's no commitment to saying that you should not push them to the point of break, or that there's some value in having them. It's essentially that if the IMF is useful in enforcing something on China or Argentina or Pakistan, for instance, then he will use it. But he actually no longer actually believes in the value of an institution like IMF for the world order. What he really believes in is that America should pursue its interest to the maximum with no regard for anybody else's interest, and it does not have to compromise, and it does not have to sort of think about the world as a community. It has to think about the world as a jungle, and then it has to operate in that jungle.
Maleeha, you said there is a general disenchantment with the multilateral agencies. It's not just America is trying to completely doing something else, but among the other countries too. So what do you think, how can those institutions be reformed, particularly United Nations, for example? Was the most prominent manifestation of Second World, after the post-World War order. So there is certainly this kind of concern about how it is being dominated by certain countries, and there has been move to reform the United Nations as well, but it's not been successful. Do you think it can be done?
I think, Zahid, the paradox that we're confronted with today is that international cooperation is needed more than ever, because we live in an interconnected world where one issue doesn't just affect one country, it affects all of us, whether it's climate change or it's armed conflicts or unresolved disputes, you can go on and on, or trade issues. We need international cooperation, and yet the paradox is that it is under stress and it's being challenged. And at the popular level, because that was the main spirit of your question, at the popular level, obviously, people see these multilateral institutions and see them being used as tools, as Vali also said. That also leads to disenchantment and disillusionment. And I think one point I would just add to what Vali said, of course, the United States has always believed in some form, maybe it's an exaggeration to say always, but most of the time it believed in a form of a la carte multilateralism. The term has been used by somebody, I think, correctly. So in other words, you pick and choose whatever suits you, but you don't really show any concern for the others because they have interests too. That's what multilateralism is all about, that you have some concern for the other in addition to pursuing your own objective. I mean, we're all in the multilateral process because we are pursuing our own objectives, but within the context where we are also looking at the objectives of others and therefore trying to see how we can align these. So the popular disenchantment is really directed at this fact that the multilateral institutions remain constituted in a manner that's undemocratic in the sense of reflecting the kind of power distribution we see in the world today. I mean, the P5, for example, who control the Security Council, the permanent five. I mean, if you go through the list, the question that arises is, why these five? Why not have more elected members, for example? I mean, you talk about Security Council reform. I don't know how much the audience knows, Pakistan has been one of the leading countries in advocating and being very engaged at the UN in reform of the Security Council based on the democratic principles of our age. In other words, you democratize the Security Council by adding more elected members. That way you dilute the power of the P5, and you are also trying to create a more inclusive, a more accountable, and a more transparent council. I don't know how many of you know, Pakistan has served 7 times as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And each time that we have served there, we've always said, open it up, make it more accountable, answer to the questions that are raised in the public mind. And we're not the only ones. Most, if not all, non-permanent members call for greater openness and greater democracy. So, returning to your question, if we are able to see some kind of reform, and we can reform the structures of these multilateral institutions, and I'm only mentioning Security Council because it is the key. It is the premier body that is charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. It is supposed to resolve disputes that exist in the world, whether they are festering disputes like Jammu and Kashmir or Palestine. But this is the body that would need to be reformed, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other countries as well, to make it respond to the needs and the dynamics of the 21st century. The 21st century is not about just 5 countries wielding a veto. I mean, to cite one example, Soleimani's assassination, which you all know about, was not even discussed in the Council. It had very, very serious consequences for our region, for the world. It didn't even come on the agenda. What happened was that the Iranians and the United States wrote letters to the President of the Security Council, but it wasn't discussed because one country, I don't need to name that country, didn't want it discussed, one permanent member, along with its allies. So, when the public, this is just an example, I mean, the example that hits home here in our country is, of course, the fact that, for over 70 years, Jammu and Kashmir has been on the agenda of the Security Council, and it remains unimplemented, the resolutions. So, Palestine, and the list goes on and on. So I think unless we see the Council being reformed and we see other multilateral institutions as well, not just this, but the IMF, the World Bank, they still reflect the post-Second World War order. And that order has changed. We're not living in a world where we have to just respond to the victors of the Second World War. It's been a long time.
That's right.
And next year at the United Nations, they will be discussing some of these issues. In fact, not even next year, later this year, because it will be 75 years since the creation of the United Nations. And I think some of these questions are going to come up in the public mind as well, which is, okay, so 75 years on, we know that you have made progress in many areas. And I think it's important, and I'll end on this note, it's important to also recall, what has multilateralism really delivered to the world? I think that's an important question too. It has delivered in many areas. In many areas it has not delivered, it has fallen short. So where has it delivered? It has led to the articulation of international law. It has led to the setting of standards for human rights, unevenly implemented, but at least the standards were set by agreement. It has led to the reduction of poverty. It has led to expanding social and economic progress for many people. So there are many advantages that all countries have benefited from, which is why most countries, if not the overwhelming majority of countries, still believe in multilateralism. 2 years ago, at the UN General Assembly, every time at the UN General Assembly, there's always one star. There's one leader who captures the imagination of the audience and the people. So I won't name the leader because then there'll be problems. But the one leader who everybody sort of got up and applauded 2 years ago, or maybe it was 3 years ago, and don't hold me to that, was a leader who stood up and spoke about multilateralism and implicitly challenged Trump's unilateral policies. I mean, the response from all continents was amazing. Africa, Latin America, Europe, you name it, Asia. Everyone sort of said, so, you know, in a way, he reflected the desires of most countries represented at the UN.
Well, you're right, actually, it has also created some kind of, support for multilateralism. Like, for example, United Nations Alliance for Multilateralism was created with Germany and France actually sponsored that. But there were about 50 countries signatory to that. So how powerful that group be, number one. Number two, the other thing, despite it may be a reaction to Trump's unilateralism, but on the other hand, I mean, can this alliance can also, produce some kind of reforms in the multilateral agencies, or just actually the reaction?
I think you're already witnessing a kind of maybe backlash would be too strong a word, but certainly a reaction to unilateral policies being implemented or adopted by many big countries. So there is a reaction. However, we have to see whether that reaction translates into a kind of an organized move to put multilateralism back on the rails, but in a manner that it's fit for purpose for the 21st century. I keep returning to that because that's important. We can't just revive what was, historically there. I think what we need is democratization, a more egalitarian system, and a reflection of the distribution of power, of global power in the world. As I said, there's no single country in the world. No single country in the world. I mean, this may surprise people in our country, but there's no single country in the world that can achieve an outcome on its own without the cooperation of others. Even if it's the cooperation which is of an ad hoc nature and not through alliances, no country can. They cannot achieve, they cannot go to war and achieve an outcome. We've seen that in Afghanistan. They were never able to win in Afghanistan despite all the money and the military force that they applied there. So, I mean, that's just one example, but in other ways too. And then the rejection of certain unilateral policies, for example, the United States asking Britain and others to not use a certain Chinese communication network. And Europe, many European countries, Germany, Britain, saying no. So, we are in a world which is, fluid, but it does need, I'll end on this and hand over to the next question you want to ask, Aya. We do need international cooperation. We cannot do without it. The problems at the global level are just too big and too important, and they affect too many people for us to simply give it up. So I think the important thing is not to throw the baby out of the bathwater, if I can use that expression, but to see how best we can make multilateralism work for everyone, and not just for 4 or 5 countries.
Kaya, Turkey has also emerged actually as a very strong a country and contending for leadership, particularly with the Middle East crisis getting worse. Where does Turkey stand today on all those issues, number one? Number two, it's also like Turkey has been very vocal, one of the few countries which have openly criticized what is described as Trump's deal of the century is about Palestinians. So is he also actually visualize himself as a man who could really lead this the area, the region, which is in complete disarray?
Well, first of all, the crisis at the Security Council that you described has been, of course, something that Erdogan used very successfully. And he started this campaign called The World is Bigger Than 5. And he presented Turkey as the defender of these lost causes, Palestine, Egypt, and now the murder of Khashoggi. So these things, the more crisis there is in the Security Council, the more power he will get from that crisis. And second of all, Turkey had a major foreign policy shift during the Prime Minister of Ahmet Davutoğlu, a scholar, a professor of international relations, who changed Turkey's axis from West, NATO, EU, to what he calls a pivot state, from a wing state to a pivot state. So over the last decade, Turkey remade its relations with the Middle East and its neighbors, and it started to upset NATO and the US and the European Union. And suddenly our new friends became China, Russia, and Iran. And because of this shift in the foreign policy, lots of the things that Islamists have been talking about have changed as well. What I've been talking in the beginning about fighting this Leviathan through the help of European Union, all these institutions, these international institutions. So they said goodbye to all that. And instead, what we have now is our only friend is Qatar. In Syria, Turkey is in deep trouble. It wants to do more incursions in Syria. It wants to have a corridor that it wants to protect. And its best friend, Russia, doesn't allow it. And Turkish foreign policy is really confused at the moment. Some people may call it sort of mastery. You know, we are playing both sides, both Assad and Putin and our own people. But it seems like chance is playing a big role in Turkey's foreign policy at the moment, because what we call the Davutoğlu doctrine is no more there, because we had a book. When we wanted to ask what is Turkey's foreign policy, we had Ahmet Davutoğlu's book, The Strategic Depth, and we could see all these ideas developed over the decades about how, you know, Turkey shouldn't just be a NATO outpost. It should, you know, form new alliances. It has this. It was once a caliphate, and it has all this power in its culture. But now that Davutoğlu is an unwanted man in Turkey, no one is quite sure what happened to all these arguments and all these ideas. And also Erdogan spoke admiringly of Trump, because, I mean, he's comparing him to Obama, which, I mean, Erdogan, I think, believes that Obama wanted to get rid of him during the beginning of 2010s, and for him, Obama is the real bad guy. And so Trump at least tells us what he thinks. He's not hiding behind a nice smile and, you know, civilized outlook, and he gives us what he really thinks. So he praised them publicly many times, and I think it also, again, with the Security Council problem, it again works for his advantage. When there's a problem in the White House, when there's a problematic administration in the White House, when there's chaos in the Security Council, Erdogan can say, you know, you need a strong leader, and in this dangerous jungle, I'm the only one who can steer Turkey to safety, and I'm the only defender of the Palestinian cause. So whenever Trump announces something as outrageous as that plan, or the Muslim ban in the US, it works to the advantage of authoritarian figures in my part of the world.
Yeah, Erdogan is not the only leader who likes Trump. There are many other admirers. So I'll take questions from the audience. So I think your questions should be short and don't make long comments. Yeah.
Good luck.
And please identify your...
Good idea. Yeah, identify.
multilateralism, their reasons for their protection. So everybody is trying to figure out what natural,
Okay,
what ideology.
I think fine. Okay, can I take second question because? Yeah, who's there?
Okay, my question is, what is actually motivating Trump? What are his core beliefs? Is it racism, white supremacy? And if that is the case, I think there can be a link between that and his disregard of multilateralism, because multilateralism doesn't really suit the white, the white cause. America first, and a white America first. I'd like Wali Nasr to please answer that.
So one more question, then I think probably ask.
Hi, thank you for your just the question. Given that Pakistan is a smaller state than the big states that you mentioned, would your advice be that we now move also towards strongmen or authoritarianism to combat or to survive? Because as a smaller state, will multilateralism, it's not getting us anywhere. So if any of the three of you could comment on that.
But didn't you try that already?
We can try it again. Some would say that it didn't work so badly before.
So there has not been dearth of strongmen in Pakistan. We have seen. Would like to answer. Yeah.
Sure. Well, you know, I know that from the outside there's a sort of a tinge of race and white privilege might be seen in his policy, but that's not the way he sees it. Racism or favoring white supremacy within the United States is a domestic political agenda. Whether he believes in it or he's using it, it's the reason why he is so entrenched. In other words, he has a core constituency that does identify with the fact that he is going to return America to where it was in the 1950s, restore the kind of supremacy the white Americans had. And mind you, that's also the way Boris Johnson appealed to many people in middle of England, that, you know, we're going to go back to where we were in the 1950s. But I think internationally speaking, he just doesn't see value in this. In other words, why are you compromising with the rest of the world on certain things when you can have your way, when you can actually force them to do things? So let's say instead of thinking about, I have to stay in the Iran nuclear deal because the credibility of the Europeans is attached to it, because generally it's a good idea, because if you come out of a deal, nobody else would sign a deal like this. If I come out of the Iran deal, how do I persuade North Korea to sign a deal? So he doesn't see sort of value in that. He basically says, I can come out of this deal, I can bully the Europeans to follow suit, I can impose sanctions on Iran, I can impose sanctions on the Europeans if they don't follow sanctions on Iran. And I can also, with North Korea, that's a whole different game, and I can bully him to the table as well. So it's a way of looking at what are your elements of power, right? And he clearly does not see cooperation as an element of power. He doesn't see value in alliances. Maybe the better way of thinking about it is alliances, building networks of alliances to getting things done. It might be a myopic view, but he just doesn't see worth in alliances. And I think that's the core way he sees it. Maybe it's come from the way he built his business as a real estate person, where everything is a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose. There's no gray area. And therefore, he sort of, there are times the Americans use these multilateral institutions to their advantage. For instance, IMF and the World Bank could be deployed in ways to put pressure or reward countries for cooperation. But that's not really, playing, along the way with everybody else. But I don't think race sort of is the motivation. It's the effect that people from the outside see. But in a way also, multilateral institutions too had a European Western tinge to them. And the breakdown is also allowing many other countries to flex their muscles where they couldn't do it within these institutions. The best case is China. I mean, essentially, the collapse of multilateral institutions is going to allow China to proliferate its own multilateral arrangements in Asia, in this region, and with Europe. And in a sense, they might see it actually as something that would reduce Western power.
Maleeha would like to comment?
What was the question?
About would like to talk about strong men?
Strong men. No, I think if I believe in anything, authoritarianism is not the road to any kind of bright future, I think anywhere in the world. I think the consequences of authoritarianism always catch up. It may take a few years, but there can't be anything positive about it. But I do believe that there should be feminization of multilateral institutions. I think we've given men too long a chance, and I think it's time that women's voices are heard and women are represented much more in multilateral institutions. And the reason for that is not just because I'm a woman, that's one of the reasons. It's also because I think women are instinctively cooperative. I mean, I think we are, as members of families, in a way, we bring people together. We do not seek to divide. I mean, there may be notable exceptions, but generally speaking, so I do think that one of the ways in which I think multilateral institutions should be reformed is to ensure that women's voices are heard, and not just voices from governments, voices from civil society, voices from the street, voices that really matter and can change the destiny of countries. So I really, truly believe in that. Authoritarianism, no.
So what you are suggesting, Pakistan needs a strong woman.
I didn't say that, but I think, yes, I mean, if you cut out the adjective strong, yes. The rest I will sign up to. I think all the girls here will sign up to also, right?
So I think, yes, go ahead.
5 years back, Vali, I asked you a question here in the same hall, that Putin is the most famous and popular president. You told me it's a temporary phenomenon. Now, after 5 years, many strong men have come up. What do you think after you come after another 5 years? Democracy will be out of fashion then? And the last, very small question for Maleeha. You said America has lost in Afghanistan. Do you agree with American thinking that we lost because of Pakistan interference?
That's an easy one. I'll answer that at the
And
very outset.
First we'll take two more questions, and then we'll go to panelists. Yeah. No, yeah, wait for Mike. Yeah. It's just this lady is there.
Is it on?
Yes. I'd like to ask.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So in terms of the consequences for this retreat or rejection from multilateralism, especially when it comes to the US, the UK, these historically great powers, what are those consequences, especially in light of the emergent multipolarization of the world with African Union and other actors rising on the road to 2050 and beyond?
So one more question. Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, my question is about I guess, the dearth of multilateralism. But I want to ask about the fact that where do you think it started? Did it start at the macro level by these strong men or these bullies? Or do you think it is because at the micro level, each of us is otherizing the other one, whether it's US versus the rest of the world, whether it's Shia versus Sunni, whether it's Pakistan versus India? Each one of us thinks of the other in a certain way, and it could be that it's the reverse. And so then my second part of that question is, what can each of us do to not otherize the other?
Yeah, I think, will you go to, yeah.
Yeah, the otherizing question, I think, is very crucial. In Turkey, we saw that a lot. I mean, the seculars were otherizing the Islamists, and then when Islamists came to power, they started otherizing the secularists. And with the advent of social media, we had a great social upheaval in 2013 in Istanbul called the Gezi uprising. And suddenly people noticed that they were only listening to people who were like-minded. Like, if you followed those events on Twitter, from your friends, it was a different story, and if you were following them from the conservative part of social media, it was quite another story. And that's when I think we began to understand that this otherization is maybe here to stay, and it's also strengthened by technology. And the only thing we can do is just to stay in our group and defend it. And so, I mean, I call myself a liberal, and I always said, you know, we should be in the middle ground, you know, we should look at how they see the protests and look at the other view. But people always called me naive, like, you don't understand this. This is a war of, between the others of Turkey. So I think this is increasingly how people feel. In England, for example, maybe frustrated white males think that if we don't fight back, all these LGBTQI people will take our jobs, you know, we'll be discriminated against, and all these fears and anxieties make people think that way. And as for liberals like us, I don't know how you define yourself, we are called maybe idiots or naives, and so we are the ones who lose it.
Vali, do you want to say?
I just want to very quickly say that, you know, we have to be not put everything under the rubric of multilateralism. I mean, you know, multilateralism itself goes back to the gold standard and 19th century international financial order, and fighting and difference would always be there. I mean, the core of multilateralism, what it, at least I would say, means accepting a set of rules and norms, what Maleeha referred to. So, you know, you create institutions that had rules and rules. Like you go to in the climate agreement and you say, everybody has this amount of votes and we all agree to reduce carbon by this much, and we all agree to do this, and this is how we resolve our conflicts, and we all abide by these rules. So the first step is that a group of countries agree to accept rules and obey rules and follow rules. It's really about law. And it's not about that you like each other. Countries that hate each other can join in the same institution, provided they follow the same rules in order to solve the same problems. I mean, that's really the core of what should be a multilateral order.
I have a question, please.
May I respond to your question? I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, the US can always be relied on to do the right thing once it's exhausted all the other options. So I think that's applicable to Afghanistan. For almost 18 years, Pakistan kept cautioning the United States and kept urging the United States to find a negotiated end to the war. It took them 18 years to get to where we were, but we welcome that now. I think the commitment to peace and to find a negotiated settlement should be welcomed. So my indirect answer to your very direct question is, I think we're cooperating for peace now, and the big challenge now is how to win the peace in Afghanistan. So I will leave it there. To Asif's question, which is a very important one, the consequences of this rejection or this weakening commitment to multilateralism, I think the consequences are all very negative, because what you will end up, we are already ending up in a world where there is much greater disorder, there is much greater instability. And as Vali and I have been making this point, and Kaya as well, this weakening commitment to rules and norms already agreed to is going to inject even more unpredictability to our world. And in fact, we're seeing leaders act in rather whimsical ways, which is also contributing to instability. So there's nothing good that's going to come out of it. So the answer has to be, a more broad-based response to these unilateral policies on the part of countries which I think are in vast majority to band together to ensure that multilateral institutions remain strong or are reformed in a manner that they are strengthened. Because I think the path to making the UN more credible and more respected in the eyes of people, especially young people across the world, is to ensure that its institutions are reformed. And reform would be the way to renewing people's faith in multilateralism more generally, and of course the UN in particular. So I really earnestly believe in that. Thank you.
Do you have time for one more question, I think?
I just
I think last question.
One more question, please, from Maleeha Lodhi. Right here, sorry. So even with regards to the Munich Security Conference this year, we saw such a stark kind of a difference between the worldview or the governance architecture / model that Europe has in mind or America has in mind, and America seemed completely in denial. But the interesting part is, with respect to this multilateralism or UN losing its efficacy, I happened to interview the Secretary General from the UN recently, and he completely acknowledges it. He understands that it's a problem. The question I have from you is, because you've been a part of, you worked over there, are we going to see resistance from the P5 regarding this, and how quickly or how long will it take to actually see a restructure?
Well, I can tell you very briefly, because we don't have time for a long answer. The process of negotiations for Security Council reform has been going on for almost 2 decades. And I'm afraid there is complete deadlock. And the deadlock is over this issue of whether there should be more permanent members, which we feel in Pakistan, and in fact, I think the Secretary General would probably agree with us, is that if you want to reinforce failure, then you add permanent members, because they're part of the problem. Part of the solution has to come from more elected members, and therefore, I think, the P5 would have to sign up to reform. Look, reform of Security Council will involve an amendment of the UN Charter, which is no different from amending our constitution or any country's constitution. So it's a very, very sober and prolonged process. But in this case, you need 193 countries, and there's certain processes that have to be followed. And yes, the P5 would have to agree to this kind of widening or democratization of the Security Council. And I think that's the paradox. The paradox is that reform is stalled because of contesting visions of reform. We belong to the group of countries that want more elected seats. And then, of course, you have the G4, I don't need to name them, they're familiar to all of you, who want permanent seats for themselves. And what we say is, who are you to assign yourself permanent seats? This has to be done by election. And if you believe in elections in your country, then you should believe in elections to multilateral institutions too. You can't say this is good for us, but it's not good for international institutions. So this is going to be tough, but I think it will remain a very critical area if we have to renew faith and confidence in multilateral institutions like the United Nations.
I think I don't know whether we have time for one more question or it's all. There are many more questions, but I think last question. Yes, come
on. My name is Nawaz, and Maleeha Saiba. This question is for Maleeha Saiba. Maleeha Saiba, you. Sorry?
पूछे ना वो बाहर से आए हैं उनसे भी सवाल पूछें.
Well, the question I have in my mind it concerns you.
But somebody else can answer.
Maleeha Saiba, you had succeeded in holding on to your ambassadorial jobs to various governments, including People's Party, PMLN, General Musharraf, PTI. Which tactic did you use to win these all, please?
Okay, thank you so much.
You serve different governments.
Thank you, Zahid.